Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. It is remarkable to think about how the American Federal Reserve has kept the economy from collapsing not once, but twice in the last 13 years. First, in 2008 and the years that followed, the Federal Reserve pumped trillions of dollars into banks and other financial institutions just to keep capital flowing. It happened again starting in March of 2020 when the pandemic threatened to topple the entire global economic system. Now, on one hand, you could make the argument that this was a good thing. A true economic collapse is bad for everyone. Many people, if not most people, would lose their jobs and lose their livelihoods. But on the other hand, the Federal Reserve only gives to financial institutions that are, by definition, already wealthy. And that has been a significant driver of income inequality over the past decade and a half that truly rivals the inequality we saw going into the 1929 crash of Wall Street. And the paradox is this: the Federal Reserve, on its very own, can greenlight trillions of dollars for the financial sector, while money for the poor has to go through this rigorous legislative process in Congress just to get approved. We are talking about trillions of dollars for the financial sector, and if we're lucky, billions of dollars for poor people. Also, with the Federal Reserve, there is no Joe Manchin or Kirsten Sinema ready to stop whatever it's trying to do. Today we are going to talk about this dynamic, and we're going to talk about how the economy almost crashed in March of 2020, and we're going to do it with an economic historian. Adam Tooze is a professor of history at Columbia University. In 2018, he won many awards for his book, Crashed. His latest book is called Shutdown: How COVID Shook the World Economy. Adam Tooze, in your book, Shutdown: How COVID Shook the World Economy, there were just a number of lines I was reading that made me stop and think. And one of them came right at the beginning of the introduction when you write this: "The danger it posed," meaning the pandemic and the virus, "disrupted the daily routine of virtually everyone on the planet, stopped much of public life, closed schools, separated families, interrupted travel both within and between countries, and upended the world economy." I had to stop after I read that sentence and just think to myself, when I was covering at the end of 2019 the impeachment of Donald Trump, I would have, if I would have been able to see that line ahead of time of what was about to come, I would have never believed it. And it's just, I mean, sometimes it's interesting to take a step back and just contemplate on what has happened in the last year and a half.
Yeah, I hope if the book is useful, that it's useful in that way, in a sense. I mean, the first line of the book pretty much is, there's one word in it that encapsulates that last year. It's disbelief. I mean, I do think we struggle, and I feel actually a kind of sense in which we keep sliding away from it even as we're still in it, because we're not done with this pandemic. Especially not at a global scale. And nevertheless, we're already sort of off on the other things, because looking back at where we were last year is in some senses just too horrifying. And it's just unprecedented in human history, I think, that we have had a simultaneous interruption of the ordinary processes of life to that extent. It basically affected everyone on the planet, give or take a few very unusual places. In economic terms, it's the largest, most sudden, most dramatic shock we've ever been able to measure anyway, and we're pretty confident that the economy is now more, in some senses, more unstable than it was when it was agrarian, back in the 500,000 years ago. So we think, virtually everyone in the global workforce. It wasn't even a number I knew, but the global workforce is about 3.5 billion people. You can figure it out, 7.8 billion people on the planet, so that's the adults. And of those, 3.3 million people were under some form of unusual constraint or restriction in their work in the spring of 2020. 1.7 billion young people furloughed from education. Never seen anything like it. So it really is. It's a shock for a historian to say something, because in a sense like this, because often the job of historians is to say, well, we've seen it all before, this is just like XYZ that I know about. But I just don't think that's the message here. The message here is, in light of what we do know about the past, this is singular.
So nothing in history that we've seen like this before. I guess that would include the Spanish flu at the beginning of the 20th century. And I don't mean to be ridiculous by this comparison, but that would, I guess, also include the great plagues of the 14th century that ravaged Europe and parts of Asia.
Well, I mean, those are much worse medical events. I mean, the Spanish flu was an absolute killer and, ravaged the world in a way that mercifully we have escaped. And sort of terrifyingly, it took young people rather than the elderly. But, I spent years working on the history of diplomacy after World War I, which was taking place at the same time as the Spanish flu. And, periodically somebody would drop out of the Paris Peace Conference because they were feeling a bit poorly, and sometimes they didn't come back. But life didn't stop in the organised, concerted, comprehensive, collective, literally globe-spanning way it did in March and April last year. That's the difference, right? It isn't by any means the lethality of this disease. I mean, absolutely, the plague, cholera, there are much worse killers. And as the virologists and epidemiologists threaten us, this, we got off lightly with this one. This is a couple of mutations away from being much more dangerous than it actually is. It's the reaction that's so different. And that's what's so amazing, is that this was largely chosen, right? This is why the book's called Shutdown and not Lockdown, because I think the term lockdown is this polemical, in 2019, lockdown was all about what happens in prisons when, prisoners rebel. If you look on Amazon and you type the word lockdown, and it's a bunch of sort of exploitation novels about prisons. We, in fact, chose this on the whole. Not everyone, not on the same terms. There's power in play here, but broadly speaking, this was a decision to meet this biological threat this way.
I remember at the early days of the pandemic being a bit surprised how far we were willing to go to shut down the global economy. Up to that moment, I was like, there's nothing that would ever stop the economy. It just seems to be too important. The powers of be would never stop the wheels of capitalism. And yet, in some ways, it very much did. Were you surprised?
Yeah, this totally took me by surprise. I started the year working had been for a while on a history of the climate crisis. That was my next big project after Crashed. And the basic thesis of that was exactly like you say, what is the climate problem? The climate problem is the capitalism problem. And that's why it's so difficult to do anything about it. And then this happened. I wrote a kind of an op-ed piece for The Guardian in the spring saying, this puts paid to the idea that the economy is Trump's. That famous line, "It's the economy, stupid," that dominated the Clinton era of the 1990s. Well, that didn't turn out really to work quite like that. Now, that was the initial impression. Of course, the story becomes much more complicated from March, April onwards. And even during March, global GDP contracts, but it doesn't implode. It doesn't stop existing. 80% of economic activity continues. But yeah, I completely share with you this sense of bewilderment that what we were willing to do in terms of just a retreat away from our ordinary activities. And in some sense, it's, obviously still hasn't come back. We don't travel the way we used to. Travel used to a considerable extent dominate my life. And I haven't, been to Europe since. Well, I've been once actually, but it was an exceptional trip, and rather than something that was habitual for a while. So it's been a huge disruption.
I'm not a historian, but I am a history enthusiast, and I guess one way I have felt about this pandemic and travel, I've hardly left my own neighborhood in the last 18 months. One way I've looked at it, though, is people have always migrated throughout history, but for the most part, throughout the vast majority of human history, most people stayed within just a few miles of where they lived. And so that's what I get to experience now, what it was like for most people throughout history.
Yeah, a return to, there's been a fashion for that in many parts of the world. People have been traveling around. Some of my more imaginative students took themselves on road trips even during term time, because if you're taking your classes remotely, there's no reason why you shouldn't go on a road trip. Take your classes from Airbnbs around the entire world. So there is the possibility of traveling, but it remains confined within certain boundaries, or it can, as you say, be an existence which is much more local than ever before. I think going outside is crucial in any case. I think that's what we all discovered, that the actual experience of confinement is enormously stressful, but perhaps being limited in how much long distance travel we could do is not in the end really an existential challenge.
That juxtaposition or comparison, anyways, between climate change and the pandemic and our response to it is striking, because I think the same thing when it comes to climate change, or at least my thought has been, there's no way we're going to stop this. We just can't stop the machinery of the world economy. It's just too big and it operates on its own. I don't know if we're going to be able to stop it. And then we get this pandemic, and as you point out, it didn't completely stop. 80% of it was still happening, but still, we were much more proactive and willing to act when it came to the pandemic. Do you think it was just that the virus seems so much more immediate?
Yes, I do. I think, and it attacks our bodies directly, and it makes us into each other's enemy in a sense that it's infectious between people. It's not some external force like the climate that we indirectly or directly affect, and then by way of that we indirectly affect other people. When you fly, you inflict damage on other people, arguably, if you accept the logic of the climate diagnosis. I think that's a key part of it. I have to say, as the pandemic has gone on and as we confront the ongoing crisis that it is, or rather we don't confront it, I've sort of tipped from an optimism, which I would agree with you. We've clearly shown that we can do things. I think the real question that's more and more pressing is whether we can get our act together, frankly, to do them, and to do them consistently and stick with the discipline that's necessary. Or even if you take the immunization vaccine programs, whether we can exploit, as it were, the technologies that we do have, which we know are solutions to the problem, at the scale that's necessary to actually produce an adequate answer to the problem. I mean, it isn't merely a cliche, it's simply true that we're none of us safe until we're all safe. And on the one hand, it's a miracle that we've managed to vaccinate half the world's population since the vaccine programs began. But on the other hand, it's also crushingly disappointing that that's only as far as we've gotten. And the progress into the poorer parts of the world is agonizingly slow. And yet without that, we know that we're at risk of some disastrous mutation and some dangerous new strain that just breaks through all of our defenses. So it's a very confusing, very contradictory impression, I think, that this period leaves.
Here in the West, we went a long time without a pandemic. I think leading, and I felt this way before this one, that we were past that period of time now, which used to ravage empires from time immemorial. How do we? You mentioned earlier. You said earlier that it's only a matter of time until we get something hit with something much harder, much more lethal than COVID-19. How do we know that?
Well, this I think is a crucial part of the story, in that we are dependent on science to give us our bearings in this sort of situation, and in the same way as we are all adjusting to the extraordinary, gigantic implications of the climate diagnosis, I think we should hearken to the public health people, the virologists. It's a branch of epidemiology called emerging infectious diseases that over the same period roughly that our scientists have been helping us to try and understand the climate problem have been telling us exactly this, that there's a kind of an arms race. On the one hand, we have expanding capacities for medical care, for vaccination, for immunization. That's as it were, the positive side of the story. But there is also basically an escalating risk, and the escalating risk arises from our ever more intrusive and comprehensive incorporation of nature into human systems, the massively intensive agro-industrial systems which generate our meat-heavy, dairy-heavy diet, which are basically recipes for zoonotic mutation. And then the fact that we live this, ambulatory, transport-heavy lifestyle, which means that we stir the pot and people move around. And if you add all that up, basically it's a recipe for epidemiological disaster. And though these crises have so far affected minority populations in our part of the world, the first real shock of this type is, of course, HIV/AIDS, which in sub-Saharan Africa became a endemic, total societal catastrophe against which we're still not proof. And it took quite a while before COVID overtook AIDS in terms of mortality in 2020. We're now well past the point at which it has, but that crisis is ongoing in large parts of Africa. So that was the first warning, the really big warning. There were in the early 80s. And since then, I think that conviction has hardened. And if you look at the graph of scares, of outbreaks of MERS, SARS, swine flu, the concerns about avian flu in the early 2000s, the conclusion one reaches is we've basically been riding our luck. And in a sense, you could say we got lucky with the one that did in the end break out, because it isn't that lethal and it threatens elderly people above all. But imagine what this would have been like if it hit kids. The sort of existential panic, the extraordinary concern that it would have unleashed, the fact that we know that young people are broadly speaking safe, is one of the parameters of everything that happened last year.
One of the things that also surprised me at the beginning of the pandemic was how much governments were willing to spend to keep things stable. And here in the United States, we had a government that had a Republican president and a Republican-controlled Senate, and it still managed to do that. You write this, I just want to quote your book one more time. As the coronavirus overtook us, the left wing on both sides of the Atlantic, at least that part that had been fired up by Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, was going down to defeat. This is after Corbyn had to resign, and this is after Bernie Sanders clearly wasn't going to win the Democratic nomination. The promise of radicalized and re-energized left, organized around the idea of the Green New Deal, seemed to dissipate amid the pandemic. It fell to governments, mainly of the center and right, to meet the crisis. A little bit later, you say this: to meet the crisis, the very middle-of-the-road politicians ended up doing very radical things. Can you talk to me more about that dynamic?
They did, and in fact, in Europe, they even adopted the verbiage of the Green New Deal. Ursula von der Leyen, who is the president of the European Commission, once one of Angela Merkel's sidekicks. And for an American audience, it's worth saying that Angela Merkel is not a liberal. She's a conservative. She's a centre-ground conservative. So a centre-ground conservative like Ursula von der Leyen talks about a Green Deal. They just drop the new bit out and just call it a Green Deal. So this sort of weird transfusion, if you like, of the fundamental strategic insight of the Green New Deal left, that we have to think the social problem, the economic problem, and the environmental problem as interconnected. And ideally, we need to think that at a global scale. So this will be the talk of the global Green New Deal. That transfused across the political divide from the dynamic left into the heart of the centrists, conservative, more or less conservative, who were charged with actually handling the crisis. And so, and I would label the team around Biden in the first instance in that same way. I mean, they acquired a bunch of energy largely from the Sanders campaign, but Biden's as centrist as it comes, and we ended up with the Build Back Better slogan, which is their version of the Green New Deal idea. So that's one of the ironies, I think, of this situation, that the crisis confirms the basic diagnosis of that radical left position, even as the proponents of it suffer electoral defeat. It's worth saying that it blindsided everyone because the central environmental problem that the Green New Deal focused on was climate, and that had become, as it were, the symbol of all of our environmental problems. And though there is a health component in the Green New Deal program, it's not front and center, and it's couched in terms of the crises of American society and the inequalities of American society and the inadequacy of the American welfare state, not in terms of the acute risk that we could be overrun by a global disease. It's totally compatible with that, but that just wasn't top of stack. So everyone had to adjust, even those on the left who I would argue had, broadly speaking, understood the challenge that we face.
It seems to me, and we've been talking a lot about the politics in Washington, D.C. and the White House and Capitol Hill, but if we really look at the financial crises, both of 2008 and now the one we're experiencing related to the pandemic, the entity that has really been keeping the economy afloat, and please disagree with me if I'm wrong on this, has actually been the Federal Reserve.
Well, it's certainly what it does is it's like the emergency room. They're the people with the paddles in the emergency room when you first arrive in hospital, and what they do is keep you from dying of the heart attack that you're having. right? The question is whether we're not also, whether we don't also have cancer or, Alzheimer's or some other horrible affliction that's going to get us in some other way. But yes, what the Federal Reserve has gotten rather good at is putting the paddles on and, managing the patient in extreme circumstances. And yes, they're swift. They know how to act. They are not constrained by Congress. They can conjure money at the flick of a switch. And they don't just do this for the United States. They do this for the entire dollar system. And the dollar system extends out to most of the rest of the world outside China. So they have proven, for all of the crises in American domestic politics, of which we're only really, I think it clearly is with Milley's revelations, the revelations about Milley's role, we're only really plumbing the depths of those now. But for all of that, the Federal Reserve stands as a kind of bastion of technocratic capacity to act. It's also, of course, however, able to do that because it operates with an incredibly confined, narrow system in which everything is greased, as it were, to go, right? And it operates through mechanisms which are incredibly blunt, in the same way as putting the panels are or injecting a patient with adrenaline. Like, this is very crude stuff. And one of the consequences of that is that it skews inequality, right? So this is the tension. The most effective technocratic mechanism we have for managing crises and preventing the worst structurally biases in favor of those with financial portfolios, which is basically the top 10% of the wealth distribution, and particularly the top 1% and then the fraction of people within that top 1%. And so there's a real kind of vicious circle here where we get ourselves into a mess, we act with these blunt measures, and hey presto, out of that comes a further skewing of the wealth distribution. That's interesting. Do you think that has been a driver since 2008 of inequality, economic inequality in the country? Or the yes, world? I mean, there's not really much doubt about it. I mean, the question is, what's the alternative? And the alternative is not to apply the paddles, and then the system risks just expiring. So these blunt measures by the central banks also help regular working folk keep their jobs and carry on life. But those people don't significantly profit from the incredible boom in financial markets that we've seen. And that was one of the really sort of almost surreal elements of the 2020 crisis. I mean, even on January 6th, as you can see America's polity coming apart before your eyes, the markets, at least on the morning of January 6th, were just booming. Why? Because the Democrats had won in Georgia. That was the first bit of news they got. And so they knew there was going to be a giant fiscal stimulus. So everyone's feeling incredibly frisky in Wall Street. And there's this incredibly surreal images of the TV screens with the mob on the top and then like the ticker running along the bottom. Market hits all-time high. So, and they're insulated, right? Because they know that between them and that chaos stand the Treasury and the Fed and that all that buffering. So even as you see the pitchforks, right, it's like, well, do we really care? No, and yeah, it's a really stark element, and it's at its most extreme in the US. It has to be said. The same logic doesn't apply with the same degree of force in Europe, but here it's a huge flywheel. Adam Tooze, in your book Shutdown, How COVID Shook the World Economy, you wrote about how close we actually came, speaking about the other side of this dynamic with the Federal Reserve, how close we actually came to an actual economic crash, especially when it came, I guess it was to the bond market. Yes. So this is the thing, that, as it were, the novelty. I mean, the book is trying to be useful in sticking things together, and it's opinionated in trying to offer interpretation. But the thing that may be news to readers is that we really did come very close to a precipice. It was steeper and more dangerous even than in 2008, in the spring of 2020. And God only knows we had plenty of other things to concentrate on at the time, so no one should feel bad about having missed this. But yes, in the second and third week of March, we were on the edge. And why were we on the edge? Because the market that wasn't working is the market that has to work. I mean, it's the market for US Treasuries, American government debt. And folks might not think of US Treasuries as being like your natural safe piggy bank, given our preconceptions about American politics. That's maybe not where you'd put your money. But because that market is so huge and normally so liquid, that's how it works for global investors. And the thing about it is it's so immense that any investor can be pretty confident of being able to sell virtually any amount of US Treasuries at whatever the price is at that moment. You don't need to worry about how large your transaction is. It'll be swallowed up by the market. And And what happened in the second and third week of March is that broke down. So first of all, the prices were going in the wrong direction. People were selling treasuries too. Normally in a panic station, you want people to buy treasuries to go into safe assets as opposed to equities, shares, which are gyrating like crazy. And the other thing that happened is you couldn't actually sell. It was a real struggle to find anyone to buy big packets. And the terrifying thing about that is that means that the piggy bank that the big asset managers have in their portfolios, they have super risky stuff down one end of the portfolio and cash or cash equivalents down the other, and treasuries are cash equivalent because you can swap them for cash normally, whenever you need in any quantity. So if that stops working, if you can no longer swap your treasuries for cash, the entire rest of your portfolio is in trouble because you don't hold those risks unless you know you've got this liquidity there. And this was compounded by the fact that as the equity market went into just meltdown, fund managers who were getting calls from investors saying, I want my cash now, I want it out, were being forced to choose what to sell. And the things they were selling were their piggy bank assets. So the market is swamped by sales of treasuries, and it's absolutely terrifying. I mean, whenever I speak to financial market participants about this, you think, they know all this, they want to move on, let's talk about geopolitics, China, climate, something like that. But no, what they really want to do is relive this moment because it was basically the scariest moment in their professional lives. Speaking to somebody in Hong Kong the other day, he was saying he'd had this day, 17th of March, I think it was, when he tried to sell $2 billion worth of treasuries, as you do if you're a big fund manager, and he couldn't find anyone to buy them. And that just can't happen. And he said he reeled out of his office in Hong Kong, stumbled out onto the street, looked up to the skyscraper that had his apartment in it, and said to himself, if I couldn't sell those treasuries, what could I sell my apartment for at this point? Right? If you cannot liquidate the most liquid thing in the world, much less liquid things like apartments are just, they're dog doo-doo. I mean, you are in trouble at that point. And then the entire credit pyramid begins to spiral down. So that is what we faced. And you can tell how serious this was, not really from what actually happened, but from the forces that were mobilized to prevent that disaster from happening. And what the Fed basically did was, first of all, make it incredibly cheap for private business banks to buy the treasuries as people tried to sell them. And then when that wasn't enough, they started buying them themselves. And the Fed was buying $1 million of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, which are treasury equivalent, a second in the last weeks of March. They bought between 70 and 80 billion a day. They bought 5% of the market in a matter of weeks. And this is totally unlike anything we've ever seen before, much more dramatic than in 2008. And without that, we wouldn't have gotten to first base. Without that, we would be in a very different world from the one that we're currently in.
And at the same time, this kind of gets to the paradox you were talking about earlier. This would also, though a lot of money has been put into the economy in other ways, but this could also be a driver of inequality.
Oh yeah, because the portfolios they're worried about unraveling are hedge funds, private equity, JP Morgan, giant asset managers. This is the hub of the super wealth elite, like absolutely. And that's who they were rescuing at this moment in the first instance. Because if those dominoes start to fall, the whole thing goes. So it's not like Lehman where we can put a name on it and we have the famous images of them taking the hoarding down and none of that. This is more behind the scenes than that, but no less consequential. And yes, absolutely. In the first instance, what you're doing is saying that quite speculative gambles on this notionally very non-risky asset are going to be made good, because we can't afford to have your mistakes is perhaps too strong a word, the backfiring of these gambles, which under normal circumstances are predictable, but under this circumstance have gone bad. We can't afford to have that bring the whole house down.
There was a report from the Urban Institute that I found fascinating of late. And the Urban Institute is this think tank, my understanding, does a lot of economic modeling that ends up being used by the government or legislators when they're writing their legislation. And they had a report. It wasn't, I didn't find it widely covered, but the New York Times did a lengthy article on it. This report from the Urban Institute said that because of all the measures that were used to try to keep things stable in the economy. And this is the other side. This was sort of the CARES Act, the spending on unemployment benefits, food stamps, the stimulus checks. All these things had actually in the last year reduced poverty in this country by 45%. Now, the poverty number isn't very high, so I don't know how much you have to do to actually reduce poverty in this country. But still, to me, it was striking to me, and something that has stayed with me about, and maybe we can't continue, I don't know, with enhanced unemployment benefits or 3-4 stimulus checks a year. That may not happen, but it still was very suggestive to me, the power that the state can have in actually addressing and alleviating poverty. Do you think that's accurate? Yeah.
Yeah. No, there's no question. I mean, it's like, it seems so, banally, obviously true, but it is literally the case that if, the problem with poverty is not having enough cash, there's a way to solve that. And poverty is a choice to a very considerable extent in America, not necessarily on the part of the poor people who are stuck in the situations that they are, which are multiply determined by patterns of overlapping disadvantage, but by the fact that welfare benefits in the United States are simply not generous enough. And the result of that is misery, and starvation, or not starvation, it's certainly food deprivation, stunted childhoods, and miserable circumstances, huge levels of stress, and shortened life expectancy. I mean, to be absolutely crass, clear about it, people die as a result of this. And what 2020 showed was that a rich country like the United States, if it so chooses, can alleviate this. It cannot. This doesn't, in the short run, fix the big structural problems that lie behind that. But if the question is simply ensuring that people have enough money to buy food and shelter and clothing, then it's easily within reach to fix this. And that's what, as it were, almost in a panic, America, sort of in a fit of absent-mindedness, slid into providing exactly those kind of benefits, adequately scaled benefits, to the horror of conservatives by the summer of 2020, who realized, oh my God, like at that kind of unemployment benefit, that terrible shoddy job that exploits you and pays you, less than $10 an hour, whatever, is not worth doing. So people will not show up to do that work. And that then became a hotly contested political issue from the summer of 2020. But yes, it's true, and it'll go down in the record as this weird seismic event in that respect as well, that America built itself, or rather just sort of improvised and strung together, something that actually looks like the kind of welfare state that would be befitting of a rich country. But it's all temporary. This is the thing, right? So this famous child benefit that Biden and Harris are so pleased with, it's temporary. It's a one-year deal. It does give money to families with children, and thereby will alleviate child poverty. It's it's $300 or $400. This is not a huge amount of money. A rich country can afford this, but they haven't currently got the political backing to make it permanent. But that is within our grasp. Yeah, absolutely. It's quite clear. And you can do much more elaborate experiments. And in Europe, there was barely any unemployment. The extraordinary thing about the crisis there is people weren't made unemployment. They were moved on to so-called short-time working systems, and the public purse covered salaries and wages up to a certain percentage, the employers the rest. So people didn't even suffer the disruption of the loss of a job, which creates a completely different social atmosphere there than the sort of crisis that tens of millions of Americans suffered last year, and many, of course, still are. On Labor Day, I think the figure is about 10 million people lost supplementary benefits.
There's a lot here for future economic historians to look at.
Absolutely. This, I think, will be a turning point. The question is in what direction. Will this be a freakish one-off? I think that's, in a sense, the most optimistic reading. The worry has surely got to be that this is the first of a new type of crisis in which social, economic, political, geopolitical tensions cross-cut with new environmentally driven natural challenges.
I have, as somebody who has followed politics for a long time in this country, I have felt very confused over the past few years. As a historian, has it been difficult to make sense of this?
Very much so, yeah. I coming at it from an economic point of view, the disintegration of the American party political system has been really difficult to understand. Like, we once, had a kind of basic gravity type model of how the Republicans and the Democrats aligned and who they aligned with. And the disintegration of that has been, yes, absolutely disorientating. I understand to that extent my colleagues who want to go back to the interwar period, the Weimar Republic, for pointers. But I think in a sense that underestimates the scale of the challenge in front of us, which is to grasp something which in some ways is just novel and new in its constellation.
Adam Tooze is a professor of history at Columbia University, and he's the author of the book Shutdown: How COVID Shook the World Economy. Also on Friday, he will be debuting a new podcast at Foreign Policy called Ones and Twos. Adam Tooze, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you for taking this time.
It's been a pleasure to be here.